It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. All right, everyone. I think it's high time that I break this down for you. I had a bunch of questions recently about this, and it surprised me because I thought this topic was already visited. But then, after looking at how many times I was asked about it, I decided to go ahead and throw together an episode regarding this. I had several questions come in asking specifically about the difference between definition of done and acceptance criteria. And this was coming, of course, from people who were either doing a product owner class or advanced product owner class. They feel like the definition of ready, definition of done, and definition of acceptance criteria are all starting to get blurred together. And I get it. I understand. And my goal is going to be to help you figure this out because they're all fundamental concepts when you're talking about product development. But I think that you need to really zoom in on a difference to understand each. So let's start with definition of done. Let's go there. So definition of done, that should be applied to every single product backlog item. It's the more comprehensive checklist that ensures that quality is going to be put in place by including functionality, performance, security, compliance, and any other necessary standards that apply to every single increment. So if you're looking at the Scrum Guide, for example, when a product backlog item meets the definition of done, an increment is born. So there's some examples of definition of done that I could throw out there. If we were trying to, so look at code quality and completeness, we might say that all code must pass a peer review process with no critical issues, and more than one set of eyes need to look at everything. We might say that all unit tests are written for all code and they achieve at least 80% code coverage, and that all code complies with the team's coding standards. Now, I realize those are all technical and software examples, but you might say that everything has a certain level of uptime or almost things that you would find in a service level agreement type things. So, what I'm trying to say is when you're talking about definition of done, you're talking about a holistic definition of done. You're talking about applies to every backlog item in some fit, form, or fashion, and it's a holistic view. If I'm looking at acceptance criteria, on the other hand, that is a specific product backlog item must meet this criteria in order for it to be accepted by a stakeholder, a customer, a user, or a system. So each piece of acceptance criteria is hand tailored to individual items and detail the expected behavior, the requirements for that specific feature or backlog item or that piece of functionality. What I can tell you is acceptance criteria is not part of Scrum holistically, if you look at the Scrum guide, but it's certainly a complementary practice that really helps with transparency and adaptation. So, as far as I'm concerned, when I teach this topic, I teach that acceptance criteria. The best way to think about it is at the backlog item level, there's two ways to consider it. The first is what I call persona driven acceptance criteria. What would Susie expect to be able to do? As Susie, I expect to be able to do X, right? Those types of things are acceptance criteria. Can Susie do X? Will Susie do X? How will Susie do X, right? That is all part of the acceptance criteria at the backlog item. If you find yourself saying the generative system shall allow, that is more definition of done, because then you're talking about something that's system wide. So I hope that makes sense. But I want to give you the second form of acceptance criteria, and this is the more popular. This is called Gherkin syntax, Gherkin. And for those of you who aren't familiar, that will be referred to as given, when, then. Given this scenario, when this action or event happens, then these are the results that I expect. And if you break it down that way, it makes it easy. And the syntax is easy to learn. It uses some Boolean logic. They have some keywords that you use to create different acceptance test activities. And then once you have that all figured out, then you can start using tools like Cucumber by Atlassian or others to help you automate that acceptance criteria testing. So when you start thinking about acceptance tests, it's specific things that are specific to that item. So some examples. The checkout process should handle multiple items, at least 10 unique items in a shopping cart. The user must have the option to enter a promotional code for a discount before finalizing their purchase. The user should receive a confirmation number and an email order summary upon successful initiation. I think you get where I'm going with this, right? So if it's very much persona specific or even user specific, role specific, chances are it's a piece of acceptance criteria. If it is something that's system wide or applies to everything that you build, and it's a standard that you're trying to follow, that follows more of a definition of done. So the critical differences: definition of done is the broad checklist that applies to every single PBI, ensuring consistency and completeness. Acceptance criteria are specific to each individual BI or feature, and it details conditions that must be met in order for a requirement to be considered complete. When it comes to scope, definition of done is usually defined at an organizational or team level and remains relatively stable throughout consecutive sprints. Acceptance criteria is determined at the actual backlog item level, and it varies widely between one item and another. The purpose of definition of done is to ensure the product increment meets the quality standards as listed and is useful and ready for future release. Acceptance criteria focus on whether that specific product increment fulfills the specific requirements of a product backlog item to a stakeholder or end user. Who creates it? Definition of done is a collaborative process involving the entire team and sometimes even multiple teams or the entire product organization in some cases. Acceptance criteria is generally the product owner's responsibility, but could also be delegated, some to developers, some to analysts. It's often made in collaboration with the stakeholders to make sure that we're meeting their needs. So, do we ever go back and revisit these? Obviously. Definition of done is assessed and referenced and applied at the end of each sprint, and you can assess it and look at it once a quarter to make sure nothing's changed, or once a year if you have something really stable. Acceptance criteria used throughout the sprint to guide your development, and that should be addressed at every refinement meeting to make sure that we are meeting the acceptance criteria and that everything's going to plan. So both definition of done and acceptance criteria actually complement each other, and they work well together. So that leaves the last one that I didn't talk about yet, and that's definition of ready. So a definition of ready, this is where it's going to get interesting, is if you understand your acceptance criteria, if you understand your definition of done, you can actually put together a more holistic definition of ready, which highlights or outlines criteria that must be met before the work enters into a sprint and is deemed ready for the team to begin addressing. One of the things that I've discovered is that lots of times the team ends up doing work that, or work gets pulled into sprint that the team pulls into their queue and sees that, oh, I'm missing this item, or I don't have this piece of information, or this conversation hasn't taken place, or there's a dependency that hasn't been met. So we need to make sure that as we're putting items into the backlog, that they meet specific entry criteria in order for them to be taken into a sprint. That entry criteria is the definition of ready. Now, the good news is that definition of ready can directly correlate and feed into the definition of done and into the acceptance criteria at the backlog item level. So it all kind of holds hands and works together if you're doing it right. But I understand the point of confusion, and my hope is that through the knowledge that you've learned here, that you'll be able to really sit down and lay this out. So my challenge for you is to make sure you take the time to make sure that item that's inbound to the team meets a definition of ready, that you have a clear definition of done that's good for the organization or for the business unit or for that specific product, and that you have acceptance criteria at the backlog item level that helps make sure that we're meeting the needs of the end target consumer, of the stakeholder, a key stakeholder, and that we have something to measure against, that we can make sure that we're building the work in the best way. That's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have a topic you want us to discuss, learn more at agiledad.com. We'd love to hear from you. As always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.